Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Understanding EDI Subscales webinar. My name is Amy Mullis, and I'll be assisting on the computer side of things today. We are happy to have Barry Forer here to present everything he knows about subscales. Maybe. Dr. Barry Forer is a research methodologist and statistician here at HELP, and he, through his career, specialized in early child development and child care. And at HELP for how many years?
I guess about 13 years
13 years, and basically Barry is involved in pretty much everything that we do at HELP. So we're happy to have him. A few housekeeping tidbits before we get started. There is a question pane in your platform interface. Please don't hesitate to type in any sort of question as it comes up in your brain, and I will do my best to feed those questions to Barry, either during the presentation or afterwards, depending. We are recording this session, and barring any major catastrophe, we'll be posting it online following. We had a little bit of a rough setup, so my fingers are crossed, but we will keep you guys posted. And I'm going to take this opportunity to hand it over to Barry.
Okay. Well, hi everyone. Thank you for coming out so late in the day during the darkest part of the year, just about. And especially those people, if there are any of you out in up like at Fort St. John or in the Peace River, where it's even an hour later than it is here. So I'm going to go through and talk about subscales today and go into a little more detail about some specific results for some places around the province to kind of get you thinking a little bit about how you might apply them to where you live once you see your own subscales data, but we'll talk about that near the end. So, so I'm not advancing here. So.
Yay!
Okay. All right, hang on a second, a little technical glitch.
Oh, you gotta love technology. There we go.
Oh, maybe I didn't press it hard enough. Okay, thank you.
You're giving me a heart attack.
Okay, I was too gentle. Okay, so I think the theme of the day really, or one of the themes of the day, as you can see in the outline, is to get into some an understanding of what the subscales are all about, the items that go into them, how they differ from one another, and especially how they provide a more specific level of information that we've been used to working with up until now, when we've been just looking at either vulnerability on one or more scales, which is how we started off, or vulnerability on each of the 5 scales. This is one step farther into more information and something that you can use to understand what's going on in your place a bit better. So we're going to have to go a little bit into how subscales are measured a little bit differently than we measure the scales in terms of our neighborhoods or communities or school districts. We'll look specifically at the different subscales to give you a sense of what goes into them and how you really are looking at quite different aspects of development when you look at subscales, whether that's physical, social, emotional, or language. And then look at some subscale trends over time, both provincially, and I'm going to show some results for 4 school districts and give you a sense of how to go through some of the graphs that show the results. Finally, the most important thing, which is what do you do with this information once you have it? How do you make meaning of it? We'll hopefully get a little bit of a start there, and I'll give you a sense at the end about where we're going with subscales here at HELP over the next few months and into the next year. I guess I have to press the down button. How come I'm not doing it properly? Okay, press this one. Okay. So this graphic here is our latest graphic to kind of summarize the relation between scales and subscales for the EDI. And you have to kind of, for this one, work a little bit from right to left. We start, well, you know what, maybe I'll work from left to right just for fun. Those little dots there each represent one item, and as you can as you can see, for 4 of the 5 scales, there is more than one line of items, and if you add them all those dots up, you'd get 103 dots, or 103 items in the core part of the EDI. 103 items that can be rolled up into, in this case, 15 subscales. Communication skills and general knowledge at the bottom there doesn't have any subscales. It only has 8 items, and so it can't be broken down any further. And so those subscales, which will be the main part of today's talk, go into our much more familiar 5 scales of physical health and well-being, social competence, emotional maturity, language and cognitive development. So we'll be focusing on those. And as you know, we still report for across the province, as we did in our Fall Expo, what the vulnerability rate is on one or more scales. If you may recall, it's about 32.2% in our most recent Wave 6, which was just released about a month ago. So we're going to go into depth here. Now, this is just to give you a sense. You can't even probably read this, but we're going to look at each of these in more detail. These are all the subscales across the 4 different scales that do have subscales in terms of what their items are. And this is impossible to look at here, but as you can see, there's about 95 items there that we're going to give you a better sense of what's going on with the children across the province and in your community.
And just to interject for a moment,
Yeah.
this particular graphic is listed in the community profile report. So if you are interested in getting a better view of this, just look up your community profile reports.
Well, that's great, because one of the things I think is going to be useful as you work with subscales is to have something like this to refer to, so you really know when you're talking about a subscale, what are the questions that go into measuring that subscale. Okay. Now, there's really 2 things that really interest us when it comes to working with EDI as a way of trying to understand children's developmental health. And one is trying to understand development in different levels of specificity. And historically, as we go down, you'll see that we've kind of followed this pattern. We started off with the EDI at the very beginning, only reporting on vulnerability on 1 or more scales. We had a score on that for every neighborhood in the province and for every wave, so that we were able to, for instance, track vulnerability on 1 or more scales across time. And you can compare one neighborhood to another, or even one neighborhood to itself over time, but just on one thing. But that one thing consists of 5 different scales, which are all quite different than one another, even though they are related. And so we have more recently been looking at vulnerability rates on each of the 5 scales, because in one place or another, your overall vulnerability rate may be related more to one aspect of developmental health than another. And so if you look at each of the 5 scales, you get a sense of where your strengths and where your challenges are in your community. And same as the whole province. As you probably know from some of our other work, we have a few scales which tend to get worse over time, like social and emotional. And one scale that's actually been getting better over time, the vulnerability rate has been getting better. That's the language scale. We'll see all these things in a bit, but now we have 5 scales and a more specific understanding of children's development. Today we're going to drill down into the subscales. Now we go from 5 to 15, and now we don't have to look at, for instance, social competence in terms of it's just the overall social competence on all the items in that scale, but even breaking it down into 4 different subscales, which may have very different patterns, both in the province or in any community. So you get more information. And finally, the ultimate, I guess, since we have 103 items, would be to look at trends over time on each item. And I don't think that will ever happen. The EDI was not designed for that. But it is tempting to look at some things, and I guess we try not to think about that. Okay, so here we're going to get more specific today than we're used to by going into the subscales, which is as far as we're going to go. And believe me, think about us poor our knowledge translation people who have to create knowledge translation materials, not just for one overall vulnerability, or for 5 scales, but now for 15 subscales across all of the different neighborhoods and across time. That's a lot of information. Okay, so no matter what kind of level you're looking at in terms of whether it's one scale or one subscale or whatever, we're always interested in making comparisons. For instance, one place over multiple time points. At the province, we're interested in seeing how the overall vulnerability rate has changed over time, or whether that's true for each of the 5 subscales. And we know that's not true for all 5 of them. Language has been getting better. Sometimes we want to compare one place with another at one time point. So the most obvious thing there probably would be looking within a school district to see which neighborhoods have higher vulnerability rates than others. So you may be able to look at where you want to put your efforts in terms of trying to bring down the overall rate. And today we'll look at this quite a bit, one aspect of development with another, for one place at one or more time points. So here we want to be able, again, to be able to say that, okay, and maybe we have an increasing vulnerability rate for emotional maturity, but is it true for all the different aspects of emotional maturity? We have 4 different subscales. And so you can actually start looking at which aspect of development, whether it's a scale or a subscale, is actually accounting for where you're strong or you're not so strong. All this will become more clear as we see some of the data. Sorry for all the text here, but it's to set this up. I know all of you are aware that we typically look at vulnerability rates. That is the percentage of children who are vulnerable either overall or on any individual scale. And we report those vulnerability rates in all of our materials. And the way they were calculated was starting off with a large group of people at the very beginning, a large group of children, and finding where the lowest 10% of children were on what score for each of the 5 scales. And with the idea being that if you're vulnerable on one scale, it's the same thing as being vulnerable on another scale. And so when we look at whether a child is vulnerable on one or more scales, it doesn't matter which scale they're vulnerable on, they're all kind of interchangeable or equivalent, because they're all based on finding the lowest 10%. And that's how we've always done it, and that's how vulnerability rates continue to be done. And that way we're able to compare for instance, one area of development with another. In your community, physical health and well-being might have a vulnerability rate of 18% and language only 10%. And that means that, vulnerability is worse or more challenging on the physical side than the language side. It's all based on this cutoff that's set for the lowest 10%. The trouble is with subscales, once you go down to just the 15 subscales, is that they're not so equivalent. You can't just cut off the lowest 10% and say those are the most vulnerable children, or the ones that technically we call not developmentally ready for the subscales. And that's because on this, when you get down to the subscales, there are differences in terms of how difficult the items are and the percentage of children you would expect to be developmentally ready on each subscale. Okay, so, and you'll see this in a bit, but to give an example, one of the aspects of physical health is our children's gross and fine motor skills. Well, some of those questions are pretty hard for a kindergarten-age child to do, and so about 1/3 of children are not developmentally ready on that. But on physical readiness, which is more about they're coming to school hungry or tired or whatever, only 5% of children are not developmentally ready. And so you can't compare one with the other very easily in terms of vulnerability, because they're not really equal to one another. So someone might think that because 1/3 of children are vulnerable on gross and fine motor skills, that's the real area where people should concentrate on. But that's only because the questions are harder. So we have to find a way of making those different subscales more comparable, so we don't make any misinterpretations. And that's what we do with our subscales. This is for those of you who are listening and trying really hard. This is I think the last slide on the technical side of things. So we can't really use vulnerability rates for subscales, but we can always calculate something called a standardized score, which is basically says where a child is relative to the provincial average on any subscale. And the scale that is used is the same for every single subscale. We standardize the scores, and that allows us to compare one subscale with another directly, even if for one subscale it's harder or easier for children to be developmentally ready. It's kind of a relative score as opposed to an absolute score, and allows us to do one of our main comparisons, which is comparing children on one aspect of development versus another. Now, we're not using vulnerability here, we're using the kids' actual scores, and so, as you'll see in a second, the higher the score for a neighborhood, the better for subscales, as opposed to what we're used to for vulnerability, where the higher the number, the worse it is. So you have to kind of keep that in mind. We also use wave 2, which is the first wave that we use as our kind of beginning wave these days, as our benchmark for calculating our standardized scores, and that allows children's scores to change over time, and it allows us to follow the province over time or any place. And so you'll see in a second that wave 2 always has a score of 0 provincially for everybody. Okay, and the downside, the main downside of standardized scores, as you'll see in a second, is that they're not real scores like vulnerability rates are. If you say that 15% of children are vulnerable, that's a fairly straightforward thing to understand. If you say that the score is 0.3 for a certain neighborhood, it's as you'll see, it's a little bit harder to know what 0.3 means. But we can still use critical differences the same way we have before, and it's just a matter of getting everybody up to speed to use standardized scores, and 5 years from now, it'll all seem like old hat, I think. Okay, oops, I guess, so we're gonna look at the numbers now, and basically we're gonna look at some of the different ways you can actually look at the data to try to understand what's going on. It's mostly about comparing different places with the province, either on scales or subscales, and looking over time to see if the trends are the same or not. And you'll see what these patterns are in a second. So, don't even read this, I would say. And the idea is then to use those results to try to understand what it's all about. Do the results make sense for your in the community that you know best, given what the strengths and challenges are there? Are there some thoughts that you have about why your results are the way they are? This is where where we're trying to make meaning of the results in a community, and that's the biggest challenge I think of all, because every community will have its own story and and different reasons why you might have the pattern that you do. Okay. So we're going to look at the actual scores here. Across all the subscales. So I want you to be a little more familiar with what goes into each of them and why it's important to have subscales. So in physical health and well-being, we have 3 subscales: physical preparedness for the school day, physical independence, and gross and fine motor skills. And these are a little kind of shorthand of the items that go into each of those 3 subscales for physical health and well-being. Physical readiness, if you can see on the left there, is about whether the child comes to school essentially ready to learn. Are they well rested? Have they had enough food? Do they get there on time, and are they dressed properly? Which is quite different than physical independence, which is a whole different aspect of children's physical development, which is basically about how independent and coordinated they are. The last one is gross and fine motor skills, which specifically looks at how well a child at that age can do some motor skills like climbing stairs or holding a pen or things like that, and also their level of energy. So it's not surprising maybe that in some places you wouldn't necessarily get the same pattern for all 3 of these subscales because they're quite different from one another. So we get a little more detail here. And let's look at what we get actually. So we're going to look at the provincial trends in the scale, which is on the left, and the 3 subscales, which is on the right. A lot of you know this already. This is for physical health and well-being. The vulnerability rate started off around 12% and it's been rising over the waves. It's taken a little bit of a dip in the most recent wave, but the trend is certainly generally upwards over time. And of course, so that's an area of concern provincially. But the question then is, well, is that same trend of getting a little bit worse over time something that shows up for all 3 of the subscales? That's what the graph on the right says, tells you about. So just to help you interpret this graph, because we don't have vulnerability rates anymore, we have these numbers along the left axis there that start off at 0 in the middle and go more negative as you go up and more positive as you go down. And it's an unusual way of showing these graphs, but it's to kind of have the same direction for the vulnerability graph on the left and the subscale graph on the right. As you go higher on the graph, things are getting worse. In this case, for the whole province. And as the chart goes down towards the bottom, the numbers get higher, more positive, and it's actually just like having a lower vulnerability rate. Things are better. So if you look at the 3 subscales for physical health, you can see that they have quite different patterns. They start off at 0 in wave 2. Physical readiness for the school day, which is the one of being tired and hungry, has been shooting up pretty quickly until the most recent wave. It's the one that's been getting worse. It's the one that actually accounts the most for why physical health has been getting worse over time. Physical independence, which is the one about being independent in their washroom habits and so on, has been getting worse much more slowly. And quite different than the other 2, gross and fine motor skills actually started off getting better when we went from wave 2 to wave 3, and it's been slowly getting a little worse after that. So we have 3 different patterns. And so we are learning something about physical health and well-being, which is different across the different subscales, at least provincially. And now what I want to do is show you what these look like for, and I'll do this for all 4 of the scales that have subscales. We're going to just focus in on one school district to show what their results are compared to the province. And for the physical health and well-being, I'm going to use Vancouver School District 39. So this is very much the same kind of side-by-side graph that we had before. The difference is that we're comparing all of British Columbia, which is always the dotted line, with a particular school district, which in this case is Vancouver, School District 39. On the left side, we're looking at a comparison over time for the whole scale. And on the right, in this slide, we're looking at only one of the subscales, which is physical readiness, the one about being hungry, tired, late, etc. And you can see something interesting here. You can see that on the left, the solid line, which looks at Vancouver specifically, if you look at the line, it starts off with a higher vulnerability rate than the province as a whole. But the Vancouver line doesn't really change that much. It kind of starts off just below 15, gets a little bit higher, and ends up just below 15 again. So it doesn't have the same pattern of getting worse over time the same way the whole province does. Now, how much of a difference is there? Well, I can say that for vulnerability in Vancouver, even a 2% difference is a meaningful difference. Now, if you look at physical readiness, you see quite a different pattern for that subscale. Vancouver starts off quite a bit higher in waves 2 and 3, and even wave 4 than the province as a whole on physical readiness. Even though physical readiness is getting worse for the whole province, Vancouver, it starts off pretty high and stays high. It's only in wave 5 and 6 where essentially the province catches up to Vancouver in terms of what the subscale scores are. So this is maybe an area of particular concern in Vancouver compared to the rest of the province on this particular subscale, which is all about being late or hungry or underdressed. We don't know which of those things they are, But this is one thing that Vancouver people should look at, because there's a difference here where it's worse in the province. If we look at the other two subscales, comparing Vancouver and the province, again, we start off with the same scale graph that we had on the left, but now we're looking at physical independence, and you don't see that much of a difference. The Vancouver is very similar to the rest of the province when it comes to physical independence. And if you look at the last one, which is on gross and fine motor skills, these numbers jump around a little bit, but just to focus in on the right-hand side here, if you look at the province, which is the dotted line, starts off at 0, actually gets better, becomes more positive in wave 3, and then has been kind of working its way back for the province. If you recall, that's different than the overall pattern for physical health and well-being, which has been towards getting worse over time. Actually, on gross and fine motor skills, the province started off getting better over time and has been gradually going back to kind of where it started. But Vancouver has started off getting worse and then got better. So it's a different pattern in Vancouver than elsewhere. And again, we don't know which items are responsible for that. In a sense, we don't care, because that's a lot of information already. But what is it about gross and fine motor skills that started off getting worse in Vancouver, then got better? Why is that different than the rest of the province? Okay, so this is how we kind of interpret these things. I know it's a lot to look at very quickly, and if you have questions about them, I encourage you to type them in to clarify anything that I'm saying here, because it is like talking to a screen right now.
I do have one question.
Do you?
About this particular scale and subscales. There was a person asking about the connection, a reasonable connection to some of those contexts you're talking about. So she's wondering if these subscales are related to child poverty. And I mean, I think we know yes, but as Barry said, there's a lot of information in here, and it is quite different for each district. Maybe you'd like to expand, Barry.
Yeah, and so I think to for instance, to see whether child poverty was, at least something that was highly associated with these patterns, we'd have to look at what the poverty rates are across all the different school districts and see if somehow they kind of line up or seemingly explain a little bit about why you get the patterns that you do. Could very well be. I'm not sure, for instance, on the one about physical readiness, where Vancouver started off so much worse than the rest of the province, does that mean that, does Vancouver have a higher poverty rate than the rest of the province? I'm not 100% sure, but that's something you can start to look at. Putting it in context is actually very challenging, and it's one of the things we talk about all the time, because we want to help people around the province not just monitor their children's development, but help them in terms of understanding what it might mean. One of the people that helped, Brenda Poon, is going into a few communities in the Kootenays mostly, and looking in depth at some of the processes that are going on around early child development, and what kinds of planning structures are in place to see if that can have some explanatory power about why things are the way they are. But you have to really look on a community by community basis sometimes, and sometimes there are major shocks that affect everybody. And you'll see later, so it's so many levels at which these things can be affected. And it's a big challenge. Hope that helped a little bit. So let's look at a different scale and subscales, and we'll switch to a different school district as well. Here's social competence. Social competence has 4 subscales, and no guarantee that they're all going to be have the same patterns across the province, or even certainly from one place to another in the province. Let's look at what these 4 things actually look like, just so you have a bit of a sense. Eventually, you're going to have to go to our website and kind of like print out that page when you're looking at subscales, so you can actually see what goes into some of these things, because sometimes the title of it doesn't always tell you exactly what it means. Overall social competence is kind of the typical thing you think about social competence, about kids getting along with other kids and with and being cooperative and playing well and so on. Responsibility and respect, if you kind of maybe focus on respect, so respecting adults, respecting children, property, following rules, and so on. That's what that's the second subscale within social competence. Approaches to learning is something to do with essentially how well equipped a child is to kind of handle a structured learning situation like a classroom, in terms of whether they can follow directions, do work on time, follow routines, and so on. Approaches to learning. I guess it's kind of a social, figuring out how to do well in a school setting in context with the teacher. Readiness to explore things is all about eagerness to do things, curiosity. And so, again, 4 different aspects of an overall scale. And if all you looked at was the overall vulnerability rate on social competence for your neighborhood or your school district, you wouldn't know if it was due to one or more of these different subscales. That's the beauty of the subscales. In fact, when we look at the province as a whole, vulnerability, as you can see on the left for social competence, has been getting worse over time. Generally speaking, it's gone up about 2.5 percentage points from wave 2 to wave 6, which is certainly meaningful from our kind of critical difference perspective. But if you look at the 4 subscales that go into social competence on the right there, and remembering that as you go up, it gets worse, the same way as vulnerability does, only 3 out of the 4 subscales show a pattern of getting worse over time. One of them, and that's the one on the bottom, readiness for this to explore new things, actually has been getting a little bit better or staying more stable over time. So again, you get more information about social competence, and if you're interested in one or the other, I think approaches to learning, for instance, you think of something that has quite a lot of potential explanatory power about how well kids are going to do in terms of some of the academic things in school, but being able to follow directions and do things on time. That's a big part of doing well in school. Okay, now I'm going to look at a different school district this time, just to change things up. This is School District 70, which is on the island in Port Alberni. And just to see how well you guys can follow these graphs, remember the graph on the left is the overall scale, and the graph on the right is going to be each of the 4 subscales. It goes into, in this case, social competence. The dotted line is always the province, and the solid line is always the school district that we're using for comparison here. And what you see in the overall social competence scale is that the solid line is always a little lower over time than the provincial line. So Port Alberni, although it has been getting worse over time, started off better than the province. And if anything, by wave 6, it's kind of caught up to the province. But generally, over time, it's actually started off quite a bit lower. And well, maybe maybe that's a good news, bad news situation. Maybe it was better, and now it's not better anymore. But that's overall social competence. So let's look at how that breaks down by the 4 subscales. Okay, so the first subscale is called overall social competence, which, if you remember, is not a very descriptive term, but it's about how kind of playful and friendly children are with other children. And you see more of a separation there. You see that Port Alberni is doing pretty well against the province. It's always lower, but it's, on the other hand, it's still getting worse over time. And if you followed this for the next 100 years, maybe it would be not so good. But this is one area of overall social competence, which is very similar to what you see for the overall scale. Responsibility and respect. On the dotted line, you see that's going up for the whole province. And what you're seeing for Alberni School District is that it did go up from wave 2 to wave 3, but it's been pretty steady ever since then. And so there's been quite a gap in terms of the Alberni School District doing better on responsibility and respect than the rest of the province in the last few waves. Approaches to learning, again, better than the province, but showing also this kind of increasing, a worsening over time. And finally, the one that's quite different than the rest, readiness to explore new things, which is about the curiosity and eagerness In this case, Alberni shows this pattern generally of getting better over time, whereas in the province overall, it's pretty much stayed stable. And so I guess this is a good news story for Alberni, and it's the one, well, it's the one place where the pattern's quite different over time than for the other three subscales. Okay, I'm going to do one more, then I'm going to do emotional maturity, then I'm going to see if there's any questions. This is a really interesting one, especially with all of the emphasis these days on children's mental health. And also, I think these are some very kind of obvious or like approachable categories of subscales: pro-social and helping behavior, anxious and fearful behavior, aggressive and hyperactive and inattentive behavior. These are all, as you can see, different aspects of emotional maturity, and ones that, like I said, are kind of definitely things people are paying a lot of attention to these days. And remember, when we talk about emotional maturity as an overall scale, we're lumping all these things together, and we're potentially missing out on learning, either for the province as a whole or for any part of the province, which aspects of emotional maturity are getting better or getting worse. So here's the breakdown of the items that goes into emotional maturity. Excuse me. Pro-social and helping behavior, helping people, comforting other children, things like that. These are all pretty well self-explanatory, I think, in a way, and of course, and the kind of statistics around how well these subscales work is very high, in terms of being consistent within each subscale. They're all very different from one another. Let's see if they all look the same in terms of what's happening in emotional maturity overall. And as you can see on the left-hand side here, where we're looking at emotional maturity as an overall scale, this is the one where we've seen kind of a steady rise over time from just under 12% to 16%. This is the one that's probably had the biggest increase, I think, of all the scales. But if you look at the right side, where we break down the provincial trend over time into each of the four subscales, you don't see the same pattern for all four. What you see here is that three of the four are generally getting worse over time. Did you see my hand do that when I did that? No, you didn't. Okay, so aggressive behavior, anxious behavior, hyperactivity, they're all tending to get worse over time. The one that's gotten worse, probably the fastest, at least earlier on, was aggressive behavior. Okay, but three of the four are getting worse over time, the same way as the overall scale is. But on pro-social and helping behavior, it started off getting worse at the beginning and then started getting better. So provincially, what we're finding is that children are doing better on that subscale in the last few waves, especially when you compare to what's happening with the aggressive, anxious, and hyperactive aspects of emotional maturity. Quite different patterns. And again, you could speculate about what it is that's causing that, any of the four or the overall pattern. Okay, it could be something about programs, it could be something about what's happening in society, but this is happening over the whole province. Of course, not the same in every single place. So let's pick another school district to look at what's going on with the subscales there. And this time I'm going to look at Kootenay Lake, which is School District 8 in the I think that's in the eastern Kootenays. And again, looking at the overall scale on the left, what you see is the rising pattern for the province, the dotted line that we saw before. What's happening in Kootenay Lake? Well, it starts off a little higher in the early waves in terms of the overall scale, and the last two waves it's been somewhat similar. So it tends to be a little bit worse than the province, but sometimes the difference is larger, sometimes it's not very large. And overall, still the overall pattern for Kootenay Lake is for from wave 2 to wave 6 is for emotional maturity to have gotten worse. Now that's not true for pro-social helping behavior, as you see on the right. That's one where in Kootenay Lake, pro-social helping behavior has been pretty steady until actually wave 6, when it started to get quite a bit better. In some ways, it kind of it looks a bit like the provincial pattern, which is one of well, they're getting a little worse and then getting better later on. But it's definitely not the same pattern as emotional maturity as a scale overall. So this is one subscale where Kootenay Lake tends to be doing a little bit better than the rest of the province. If you look at the other ones, hyperactivity and attention, Kootenay Lake is doing worse than the province as a whole, and is still increasing at about the same rate as the rest of the province. Look at aggressive behavior. I hope that shows up. It's pretty light. It's a similar thing. In Kootenay Lake, the scores are worse than in the whole province. Something like a 0.1 difference, just to let you know, is a good kind of rule of thumb to see where a difference is meaningful or not for big places like school districts. And you see it's rising for aggressive behavior as well, just like it is in the province. And for anxious and fearful behavior, again, Kootenay Lake has the same pattern in the province of getting worse over time, but starts off worse in the province and ends up, with a pretty consistent higher amount of anxiety and fearful behavior in their children than in the province as a whole. I'm not sure why that is, but anyone who's from Kootenay Lake who's listening today, I'm interested in your opinions about that. Okay, I'm going to stop before I go to the very last one and see if there's any questions. Anyone have a question?
Yes.
Okay.
So we've had a couple of questions about community-specific subscale information. We released the provincial information in the provincial report. That was sort of a driver for the provincial report. We are working on the community-specific subscale information with the goal of releasing that in the new year. I'm not sure if there's a specific date at this point, Barry, do you know?
No, and on subscales specifically, if that's what the question is about, I think they're going to be rolled out in bits and pieces. I think we're doing the social and emotional ones first. And I'm kind of anticipating what I'm going to say later on, but I guess I'll say it now. I mean, it's nice to know what's going on in a whole school district and how you might compare, for instance, with a different school district. But I'm guessing that what people would like to know the most is within a school district, where are the neighborhoods that are doing better or worse over time? And so at the neighborhood level, that's the thing that we're just exploring now to see the extent to which we can actually provide neighborhood level information on subscales, which I think would be the most interesting for people. But we want to make sure that first of all, that the critical differences aren't so large that they're hard to interpret. And also, it's a lot more information to do 298 neighborhoods times 5 waves times 15 subscales. That's like over 20,000 different numbers to try to make sense out of. But we are going to put subscale stuff in our online report starting in the new year for sure. Okay, I'm going to do the very last one, which is language and cognitive development. There are 4 subscales: basic literacy skills and advanced literacy skills, basic numeracy skills, and what we call interest in literacy, numeracy, and memory. It's a bit of a hodgepodge maybe there. And here are the items that go into it. These are in some ways, again, fairly straightforward. Basic literacy, children's ability to do some really basic things relating to literacy, like write their own name, handle a book. I think just about every child can handle a book at age 5. Identify at least 10 letters and so on. Advanced literacy gets into into a higher level of what children are being measured on, reading complex and simple words, writing sentences, and also some things about reading. And so you would not be surprised to know that not as many children are developmentally ready on the advanced literacy subscale as on the basic literacy subscale. But when we make our standardized score so that they're comparable, we can make that comparison more easily. Basic numeracy is, I think, pretty straightforward. The last one on interest in math and reading and memory is really about children's engagement in literacy and numeracy. Okay, so what do we see? In the whole province, as you all know, because it's the one thing that's kind of a provincial good news story, is that the vulnerability rate has been going down over time for the whole scale, language and cognitive development, from 11% down to about 9%. And if you look at the 4 subscales, that trend of going down is something that's unlike the other 3 scales where we look at the subscales. In this case, that downward trend, that trend of getting better over time, shows up for all 4 of the subscales. Basic numeracy, not quite as much as the other 3, but definitely a pattern of improvement across each of the 4 subscales, which makes sense because I think in some ways, if literacy and numeracy are more closely tied, perhaps, in terms of being similar around learning than, for instance, in emotional maturity, where we're looking at quite different aspects of emotional maturity, whether it's aggression or anxiety or hyperactivity. Okay, so let's, in this case, I'm going to, oops, I just did something. I couldn't move. Okay, I got it there. Oh, now I can go here. Okay, so I'm going to use North Okanagan-Shuswap as the school district in this case. And it's the story here is fairly straightforward for most of the subscales. As you recall, in the province, language cognitive development was getting better over time, and it's the same is true for each of the 4 subscales. The dotted lines are going down. In North Okanagan-Shuswap, which I think includes Vernon, I think it's school district 83, the pattern is not one of steady improvement, but one of some improvement and then lately getting worse again. Kind of a little more of a U shape, or sometimes it looks a bit like a W a little bit. So that this is one school district where on basic literacy, and actually for the whole of the scale of language and cognitive development, where we're seeing some early improvements, but then they've been kind of offset by some getting worse lately, both on vulnerability and on basic literacy. You see the same thing for, to some extent, for interest in numeracy literacy, something where it's getting worse and then kind of coming back a little bit. For advanced literacy, this is very interesting, and it'd be interesting to see what can be made of this, because this is not a small school district, I don't think. Advanced literacy, as you can see, wave 1 started off a little worse in the province, and they got a ton better, like it improved by an enormous amount between wave 2 and wave 3, and has been steadily kind of creeping back to getting more towards the average since then. So one of the things that might be interesting is what happened between wave 2 and wave 3 in this school district, where we had such a huge improvement on advanced literacy during these early days, and it's been actually getting a little worse over time. Okay. Alrighty. Oops, I still can't do that. Okay, so and basic numeracy is the last of the 4 subscales, and you can see that we get this kind of same pattern of getting better for this school district, and then kind of creeping back, having this kind of somewhat U-shaped curve, as opposed to the overall province, which has been steadily getting better over time. And so every place you look at looks different. Sometimes you see big differences, sometimes you see very small differences. When all of you get your subscale numbers, it's going to be interesting for you guys to look at that. The main things to remember is that and you're going to see these graphs as the numbers get more negative, it means it's getting worse. As the numbers get more positive, it means it's getting better. And you'll get some guidance about how to interpret the size of the differences too, whether it's comparing to the province, comparing to one neighborhood to another, or looking at one time point to another. Okay. The last of the scales, communication skills and general knowledge, you may recall from way back, has only 8 items and doesn't have any subscales. So we're not talking about subscales in this talk about this particular scale. There's nothing to talk about. The overall scale has been fairly flat over the waves, and so so there's not much to say about that particular one. Okay. Making meaning of these things. What I have to say, one of the things that's very challenging for help, and it's almost like an existential question that we have when we get together is, now we're providing like more and more detail about what's happening with children's development in terms of what's going on across different parts of the province and what's happening from one time 10 years ago all the way up to wave 6, which was just released. So many patterns out there, and the more detailed you look into it, whether it's looking at a subscale compared to an overall vulnerability, or looking at one neighborhood compared to a whole province, you start getting more and more into having to really know the place to be able to try to understand what some of the things are that make a difference. And that's why we have this kind of Bronfenbrenner type diagram up at the moment, because to make meaning of these things, you really have to kind of put into context the scores in terms of what's happening, or what you know about what's happening, for instance, at the school level, at the family level, at the whole community level, and even sometimes at the provincial level and beyond, because any of those things can have an influence on the scores, and some of that really is going to require a fair bit of kind of discussion with or without help people. I think the more it kind of creates an opportunity to discuss what the results mean, where the results seem to make sense and where they don't make sense. Having those discussions at the community level is a good place to start. And where help is, what we're trying to figure out, I think, is the extent to which we can, or how we can best help communities make meaning of their scores. Because after all, we are providing this information, and we want to turn this into knowledge, not just data. So we feel that doing the subscales is an important step in terms of providing that kind of more specific information so that communities can really understand the patterns of their results. And now we've opened up the box and we have to kind of sort it out, essentially. So what are we doing? We have even now we're making the subscale information available to some of the school districts that we've worked with in the past in terms of doing a pilot in terms of how to portray these things in understandable ways. And now we're going to be working with them to try to think about how to make meaning out of subscale information so that we can provide the most context around these graphs when we put them out there next year. Just to provide the information and say, go to it, I think is irresponsible to some extent. We have to have some way of providing context about what these things could mean or what questions you should ask. So we are going to, over the next few, I think early next year, start to put out our subscale results, at least for some of the scales at the school district level, online in community type of reports, and realizing that the place where people would sometimes really want to have information about subscales is at the neighborhood level, so they can compare one neighborhood with another in their school district. We're studying the feasibility of doing that. The smaller you go in terms of the number of children, the more results, these results kind of have a tendency to bounce around a little bit. And so we want to make sure that we're reporting more signal than noise. And we're just doing some testing right now to see the best way to provide that information. It's also a lot of information to put out there. And so rest assured that when we're confident to put that out, as soon as we are confident enough to put that out, we'll put that out to everybody. Okay, and I think that's all I want to say. This is a lot of information, but I'm interested in your questions. And if this seemed to have gone by, in a big blur, and in some ways it's supposed to, it's a ton of information. This will be available online, this webinar, and I'm happy to answer any questions that people have about this. And I think, let's see if there's any questions. So thank you.
No questions at this point.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to reiterate that we love to hear from you guys about questions, what you're struggling with, what you like, what you don't like, particularly as we roll out the subscale information. As Barry said, it's a lot of information, and the knowledge translation team is working through some of our lessons learned at the Fall Expo workshop, but also here today, and some other bits and pieces that we've gathered. So please don't hesitate to email Barry. He's in touch with us to share that with us so that we can iron out any issues or kinks that might come up. Or myself, or Sally McBride, who's the Knowledge Translation Manager. Pippa, Kim, also love to hear from you. So just keep the questions coming.
That's right. I know it's hard to have questions in the absence of data, but rest assured that we'll be seeing some data for all communities at some level in the next few weeks and months.
We have a listener participant from Australia, and she commented that they have not released subscale data in Australia either, but that the trends, the vulnerability trends, are very similar to Canada. So I wanted to share that with anybody who might be interested in what's going on in other parts of the world.
Right, and those of you who might have been at our Fall Expo, there was actually a comment by the Dr. Magdalena Janus, who is actually the co-author of the EDI. She happened to be in the audience and made that very comment that in Australia, just as in Canada, they are seeing that now they have 3 national administrations in Australia, and they're seeing the same general trends that we're seeing in Canada. For instance, the idea of social and emotional aspects of development trending worse over time, and language and cognitive trending better. And so maybe that says something about, I'm not sure, the similarity between our two countries, or global forces, or who knows. Let's see. That's the $64 question. Are there any other? No. Well, it's just 2 minutes until our official end, and I know a lot of you. It's already very dark outside, so I appreciate the time that you spent listening here, and please follow up with any questions that you think of with me or anybody else would help. Thank you.
Thank you.
Too much talking.